Hello, and welcome to another Worship in the Gap. This is Jim McKenzie, interim minister at First Congregational Church in Port Washington, Wisconsin. I was reading a book this week when I ran across an interesting statistic that jumped off the page at me. It was about the average number of days that a person lives. I want to take a moment and think about what your guess might be. The number of days a person lives on average. Well, the answer in the book, and I looked it up and apparently substantiated, is 27,375 days. That's the number of average days that a person will live in a lifetime. 27,375. So, being the way I am, I decided I better do some quick math. And I tried to figure out how many days I had already lived. Well, I came up with a total of 24,300, which actually puts me in the last 1/9 of my average days. That's right, I've lived 8/9 of my life, to put it in another way. So I'm in that little sliver of space where whatever I'm going to do, I better get on doing it, because there's not a lot of time left. It's actually a little bit over 3,000 more days that I have on average to live. Fortunately, I think my family tends to live a little bit longer, but you never know, and so you just have to live the days that you have, I guess. So I got to thinking, what would I do in these last 3,000 days? Well, of course, I'd want to spend as much time with my family, my little grandson, Stetson, and be a very positive influence in his life, teach him some things that I have learned along the way, and actually just try to be a good person, a good witness for Christ in this world. So to get very confessional with you about this, I think one of the ways in which I would like to improve in the last 1/9 of my life would be to become a little less judgmental. I'm not sure that I'm the most judgmental person in the world, but it wouldn't hurt to back off a little bit. So I've been thinking about that, and when the opportunity came up this week in Bible study, because we were studying this parable, it's called the parable of the weeds, with those that attended online on our Zoom Bible study. So I explained to them that there's this parable in which a sower goes out to sow seed, and he sows good seed, but then in the night an adversary comes and sows weeds in his field, and they grow up, and the hired hands notice that actually there's wheat growing and there are tares, or what are weeds, are growing alongside. And they say to the owner, "You want us to go out and pull these weeds?" And he says, "No, you better not, because you'll pull up all the good stuff too." So I said to the Bible study, do you suppose that there are people in this world who are kind of like weeds? That's what I said. Imagine that. I said, do you suppose there are people like weeds that maybe in some respects can be so destructive, so damaging to a church that they ought to be pulled out, that they in a way should be prohibited from coming to the church? I know some pastors who would take that position. And there are days, probably in every pastor's life, where that does cross every one of our minds. So I said it to the group, and one member of the Bible study said, you know, it does say in that parable that at the end when the harvest is done, it will all be sorted out and that God will do the judging. Wow. Talk about cutting to the chase. Ken really nailed it, I thought. But I said to myself inside, I know someone in particular who's very judgmental, somebody in another church I used to serve, somebody who's very destructive and damaging, and I wondered about the wisdom of, after trying to deal with this person, asking the person to perhaps find another place. Ken held to his position and he said, no, I really think it's God's business to judge and not ours. Well, let me read that parable to you, and let me allow you to make your own decision about that. This is in the 13th chapter of Matthew. Another parable he, Jesus, put before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed seeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the householder came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then has it weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. The servants said to him, then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, no, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. What's interesting about this parable, and it really should attract all of our attention, is that at this point there is another parable inserted before the interpretation of this parable of the weeds is given by Jesus to his disciples. So you have the parable, then you have this insertion of this other parable about the mustard seed, which is very tiny but grows to be very large, and leaven, which just a little bit of it can make a big difference. And then there is the interpretation of the parable of the weeds. Not an insignificant fact. So This chapter has a number of parables about the kingdom, and Matthew is very sensitive to the whole issue about judgment. Even in Matthew 7:1, judge not lest you be judged. And a few verses later in 7:6 and 7:7, if a brother has a speck in his eye, get the log out of your own eye first before dealing with him. Matthew was very sensitive to tensions in his community that he's writing to, and so this parable is a very crucial one. It's also the only time in the gospel accounts that this particular parable is used, and so Matthew has taken on the right to speak to this parable and use it for his particular theology and point that he wants to make known. So what does this parable have to say to us, particularly about the weeds? Are we to decide who are weeds and who are wheat? Are we to decide who's to be in the church and who's not to be in the church? Are we to make judgments? That's a nicer way than saying be judgmental. Are we to judge one another, or are we to endure until the time of the harvest? There's a beautiful little story. There was a man who passed away in 2004, so about 15 years ago. His name was Bill Henson. And when Bill Henson was in college, he was invited one Sunday to preach at a rural church in South Georgia. It reminds me of a time when I was at a second seminary that I went to, which was in Richmond, Virginia, and I used to go all over the countryside in Virginia and North Carolina and parts and preach in these little rural towns. So I naturally was attracted to this. So Bill Henson one day was preaching in this South Georgia church. It was a hot September day, and throughout his sermon there was a little boy in the front pews that just kept kicking his feet all throughout the time Bill Henson was trying to give his sermon. And it was very distracting to him, and in fact he became quite annoyed at this little boy and wondered where his parents were, and even said to himself, he wrote later, that during the sermon he thought to himself, this sermon is a real loser. Well, don't you know that after the benediction, that same little 10-year-old boy named Donnie came up and introduced himself and invited Bill to come home with him for lunch that Sunday afternoon. Well, Bill said to himself, as he accepted the invitation, at least he owes me that for messing up my sermon. Well, with this attitude, Bill did follow their car home and had lunch with them that day. A little bit later, I think it was a couple of weeks later, he went to his mailbox and he found this fat envelope which jingled when he took it out of the mailbox. And he looked at the return address and it was from Donnie. And it contained 57 cents in coins. The note said, "Dear Brother Bill, I'm sending you my egg money to help you go to school to learn to be a better preacher." Well, Bill remembered where Donnie's father worked, and he called him and expressed thanks, but he said, I can't take Donnie's money. I'll send it right back to him. "Oh, no," said his father, "don't do that. Donnie is taking better care of his chickens than he ever has before, and he said that he's going to send you every single penny of his profit, and he's going to continue to do that until you're out of school." Well, the months turned into years, and after Bill graduated from seminary, Donnie didn't stop sending his egg money until Bill had graduated. As Donnie grew older, he and Bill stayed in contact. And in fact, Donnie grew up to be a very successful businessman and would often stop in to check on his investment. Bill Henson added that there were times back in school where he would take that letter full of change from Donnie and he would go back to his room and fall on his knees and say, "Oh God, there's a little kid out there giving his all for me. Help me to be worthy of that gift." Isn't that how the kingdom of God works? Well, you just never know. You just never know about some kid kicking his legs in the front pew and distracting someone when he's trying to deliver a message, and the thoughts and the judgment that comes along with that, because we're all human. But it's interesting to note that it was the egg money of a little 10-year-old boy and the commitment that he sent that money every week until Bill was out of school. And even until the time that Bill Henson, the pastor of the largest Methodist church in the world, got his early boost from. That's right, that little boy who was kicking his legs, but yet who would send that egg money to Bill to help him become a better preacher, was a very small gift in and of itself. And yet, like that insertion into the parable of the mustard seed and the leaven, just a little bit can make all the difference in the world. I guess that's just the point. Pray for me. I'm going to work on being less judgmental. I think it will be good for me, and I think it would be good for God's kingdom. Because, you know, when you deal with God's world, what seems like such an obnoxious, aggravating, distracting person in the church or in your neighborhood or in your community somewhere, in God's world, you just never know. Saved by grace, all of us. Would you pray with me? Dear Lord, thank you for this day, for the opportunities to grow, to learn to be more fitting for your kingdom and to be more like Jesus. Maybe on some days it'll be enough for us that we can just be a little bit more like Donnie. But help us to grow in faith, to trust you, to sort out things at the end, at the great harvest, and help us not to worry about it, but just to be concerned about sharing your love with the world and enjoying this unbelievable world that you have blessed us with. Help us, O Lord, as we sort through our time and in the COVID crisis. Be with those who are sick and those who are lonely, those who are dying and don't have any family around. Help them to feel supported by your arms of strength and love, and may they know that they're important to us as well. Amen.
O Savior, to
Well, this is Jim McKenzie, interim minister at that wonderful little church up alongside Lake Michigan, First Congregational Church in Port Washington, Wisconsin, saying stay well, stay safe, and stay faithful. And I'll see you next time right here in the Gap.